Hello, today is the 11th of August, 2023, and today Peter Eisenman is 91 years old. Let's wish him happy birthday and let's begin our journey through his work. First, let's read a little bit about him. Peter David Eisenman, born on August 11th, 1932, is an American architect, writer, and professor. Considered one of the New York Five, together with Richard Meyer, John Haydock, Charles Whitney, and Michael Graves, Eisenman is known for his high modernist and deconstructive designs, as well as for his authorship of several architectural books. His work has won him several awards, including the Wolf Prize in Arts, or the Wolf Prize in Arts. Not too long ago, Peter Eisenman expressed a very intense interest in Alberti. And when I lived in New York City, I attended myself 5 conferences given by him at Cooper Union in the 90s on Andrea Palladio. And this actually impressed me because you wouldn't expect from a deconstructivist to have such an interest in architects like Andrea Palladio or Alberti. So I don't know exactly why I put this, the first image with this thing here, but I did. Maybe to express the troubles of an architect who to this day seems to have a rather conflictual relationship with architecture. And I will try to elaborate on this a little bit later. From formalist to weak form, the architecture and philosophy of Peter Eisenman. This was a book that was published on his work, and it's rather interesting. The very title, no, from formalism to weak form. Yeah. Here we see various approximations in plan, or vignettes with conceptual sketches of diagrammatic sketches of some of his works. Here they are called originating agents. And some of the houses that he began building, house 1 to house whatever, let's say 11. I actually value his early work, and it is a troubled and troubling work, but maybe exactly because of this, I think it has some value. And then later projects, the choral work was a book published together with Jacques Derrida, and then Biocentrum project, Nuno Tani Corporation building in Japan, the Max Reinhardt House, which was not built, and I personally regret, although it would have crushed the city of Berlin, but I personally like this building. And then the Holocaust Memorial, which is a work that even Kenneth Frampton admires. I say even Kenneth Frampton because lately his former friend, meaning Kenneth Frampton, expressed resistance, if not criticism, of Peter Eisenman. And then the Santiago City of Culture, which we are going to see pictures of. Now, talking about Frampton and Peter Eisenman, here they are, together as young people in Manhattan, probably. I don't know to whom the bicycle belonged. And it was actually Peter Eisenman who brought Kenneth Frampton to the United States. they met in England, where Peter Eisenman was earning his even his PhD at Cambridge. Here he is with Michael Graves on the right, Peter Eisenman, and then on the left, Michael Graves. Two of the New York Five, the New York Five or the New York Whites. Here he is again as a restless young man. He founded the Institute for Architecture and Urbanism in New York, where some important architects taught. And this is a scene I imagine from inside the school, that school that he founded. They also used to publish, they published some interesting, well, there were books, you know, kind of a magazine book called Oppositions. And so there was a movement of resistance against the, you know, the predictability of, you know, general education. So this was kind of a, you know, the New York avant-garde, and Peter Eisenman was always, you know, there. And to an extent, he continues to be. And here he is with John Haydock on the right. I don't know who is in the middle, but on the right is John Haydock. He died at 70, I think. And he was the dean of Cooper Union. And Peter Eisenman taught at Cooper Union. And it was there at Cooper Union that I attended 5 lectures by him on Andrea Palladio. And here he is, no, it's not him actually. This is a picture with Charles Guethme, also grew a part of the New York Five, together with Toyo Ito on the left, and in the middle, Tadao Ando. Young people, the, you know, the Japanese avant-garde, if we have to call them so. Anyway, and here he is on the left. I don't know who those people around him. And here we see, of course, at the center, the master of them all, Philip Johnson, in the first row, and then from left to right, Frank Gehry, you know, sitting on the left, then Charles Moore, Philip Johnson at the center, and then Stanley Tigerman and Robert Stern on the right, and standing on the left, Michael Graves, Cesar Pelli, Charles Guethme, and Peter Eisenman. Mr. In Between. And this is actually a compliment, you know, because important architects situate themselves in that foggy realm of in-betweenness. Like, for example, Su Fujimoto talked about in-between function and no function. And there are other architects who found, you know, not a comfortable, but a hospitable place for them, the space of in-betweenness. The Eisenman principle made his name dreaming of up impossible buildings. Now he gets to build them. And as I said before we started this presentation, I read yesterday that he said that psychoanalysis made him become a builder. Any advice for the young? Peter Eisenman, unless you are really committed to being an architect in the true sense of the word, it's a terrible business. And I wouldn't recommend it for anybody, unless you need to do it for some personal reason. I would say go into business, go into law, medicine, but don't be an architect. I appreciate his honesty because I think it's true. Unless you have that devouring passion for architecture, it's preferable to do something else. It is a tough, real, and frustrating very often. And it might be that Philip Johnson was right when he said architects are high-end whores. That is if they are lucky. That was my addition with that is if they are lucky. The architecture we remember is that which never consoles or comforts us. Now, this is a statement which probably would have irritated his former friend, Kenneth Frampton. He told me that he doesn't talk any longer with Peter. But at one point, I mean, a longer point, they were friends. But Frampton admired someone like Luis Barragan, who claimed that a good architecture is one that, you know, is conducive to peace, to harmony, to, you know, yes, finding comfort, not necessarily physical comfort, but psychological comfort. But as we can see, Peter Eisenman claimed the opposite. The architecture we remember is that which never consoles or comforts us. And because I just found out that a very important film and theater director, Romanian, Liviu Ciulei, who did run the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis, Minnesota for a number of years and taught at Columbia University and the New York University. He said that contemporary art is about bringing together all the conflicts that exist in the world and express them in a poem, in a painting, in theater. And I would imagine that Peter Eisenman would have said something similar by the way of architecture, that architecture should express the conflicts of the world as fully as possible. Now, another quotation from him: my wife has her stuff and her taste, and I have my stuff and my taste. Well, you know, a statement without too much grace or poetry. Now, his cousin, because Richard Meyer is the cousin of Peter Eisenman, this is what he said: when I am asked what I believe in, I say that I believe in architecture. Architecture is the mother of the arts. I like to believe that architecture connects the present with the past and the tangible with the intangible. Rather predictable. By the way of Richard Meyer and Peter Eisenman, I read that after the exhibition with a kind of a retrospective of the works of Le Corbusier at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, at the beginning of the year 2000s, Richard Meyer and his cousin Peter Eisenman were having dinner, I think, maybe in a restaurant, and Peter Eisenman asked Richard, so what do you think, Richard, by the way of the exhibition by Le Corbusier, or of Le Corbusier at the Museum of Modern Art, do you think, you know, at the end of our lives, I quote from memory, imperfectly, but not necessarily incorrectly, do you think we would have the same, you know, would have such a retrospective? And Richard apparently said, no, no way. So it seems that these two, you know, rather proud American architects arrived at the conclusion that compared to Le Corbusier, they were a little bit less, and maybe even without a little bit. I don't know. Here is a picture of him with Leon Krier. I used to think that although they seem to be complete opposites, they do have something in common, I would say. On the right is Peter Eisenman, who claimed that an anagram of his name would be amnesia. And on the left is a man whose a possible anagram would be Reich, from empire. And you know, I once wrote an article about this, or an essay about this. You know, about the anagrams of Leon Krier on the left and the anagram of Peter Eisenman on the right. Here he is in, closer to the present, to our time. In his office here, he is with Mark Wigley, who ran Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture and Urban Planning for about 15 years after Bernard Tschumi left. Now both Bernard Tschumi and Mark Wigley are emeritus deans of Columbia. Peter Eisenman again, Peter Eisenman again. Oppositions, as I said, it was this important publication that they made possible when when he was running the Institute for Architecture and Urban Planning in New York. Midtown Architecture Institute flowering as a student mecca. And here he is with Leon Krier. I like the way Eisenman laughs. Indeed, very different architects. You know, Leon Krier, the architect of King Charles, and Eisenman, certainly an architect who would oppose monarchy, although sometimes opposites attract and even create some kind of unity. Anyway, here is Jacques Derrida, with whom he wrote the book Choral Works. I hope I have an image here of that book. I have that book, and it's physically an object that is made to provoke, because it has holes, square holes that go through all the pages on a grid. Again, Jacques Derrida, in a malicious writing, early 90s, I called him Jacques Derider. Here he is, Peter Eisenman with his students, I imagine. I remember reading that, some students or someone asked him, why is it that he doesn't pay his interns in his office? And he responded rather abruptly and irritated that there are other ways to pay the students for their work, like, you know, having the prestigious name of his office on their CVs and facilitating their entrance into prestigious art schools and so on. Anyway, the cubes and cubes again, because Peter Eisenman was very fond of the grid, and he even stated that an architecture project always starts with the grid. But I would say he was incorrect, because as far as I know, someone like Alvar Aalto obviously didn't start with the grid, and even Louis Kahn didn't. Anyway, but Peter Eisenman was and is Peter Eisenman. Here we see, neurotical, disturbances within the cube. I say neurotical because I see, an obsessive attempt to break its majesty, the cube. But he was, and maybe still is, some kind of a rationalist who longs for the other side. We see here again, breaking down the cube, but the cube still remains like an echo or like a ghost. House number 3. I read that the clients were not very happy with the house, but the house is still interesting, in its abstractness. I don't know what the kids thought of the house. Here we see again the angst provoked by the cube he couldn't get rid of. From 1970, this house, and he built several, but he was lucky he had the clients for his neurotical objects. I mean, people who paid for the externalization of these obsessional attempts to do architecture. I do admire Peter Eisenman for the fact that he chose architecture and lived architecture and lives architecture as an adventure. And a very personal adventure, sometimes perhaps excessively or intensely personal. And it just happened that he found a way to accommodate some people into his obsessions. He invited them into his id. Some entered, reluctantly perhaps, but they entered. House 6. Now here there are some interesting things, like for example, look here on the right. Now who would do something like this, to create this extremely narrow space between two rooms? That is also repeated here, but there are interesting things here, and it might be that the fact that he declared that the psychoanalysis made him a builder was because he did need psychoanalysis, but then who doesn't? I think we all need some form of plunging into our depths and discover the monsters that are there. Are there angels as well? Well, maybe angels, some angels too, but mainly monsters perhaps. Again, something like this in any school of architecture would be totally discouraged. And not just because of the multitude of exterior walls, which would provoke a lot of loss of energy and thus high bills, energy bills. Look here also how interesting is this, how he separates water from fire, because here is the stove and here is the sink, and in between them you have this, which are, it's actually, I almost felt like using the word delicious. The way this is the kitchen, but he breaks the kitchen into two sides. And as I said, he separated water from fire in this way. There is something to be said about this, I would say. And then you have this pillar here, and then in line with it, all the way to this wall, you have a little opening. So it's an interplay between the inside and the outside, between fire and water, between the solidity and fragility, or the assertion of a column or pillar and the absence of the wall exactly in line with that pillar that I mentioned. These are interesting architectural gestures, and the building itself is still provocative in its abstractness, in its it's almost some kind of an Oggiati said that talked about non-referential architecture. This one appears to be non-referential, but it's actually referential to the id of the architect. So I wouldn't call it non-referential, but it has something that escapes that escapes an easy reading in terms of connecting it with let's say context. The building itself seems to be indifferent to the forest, to the grass, to the sky. It's abstract. It's very abstract. It happens that I like the abstraction of this house. And here we see a commentary on the reality of many couples, actually, even if what I say is not a happy thing, that, you know, that unity between him and her or between two people is often troubled. And so the opening between the two beds could express reality, maybe not as brutally as Elizabeth Diller and Ricardo Scofidio did once, you know, where they actually built a wall. They cut you know, double-sized bed, king size or queen size, into two sides with a wall, you know, dividing the bed in two. Here is light that divides two beds or separates them. Interesting chromatics, you know, green, you know, steps, a green stair, and then we see the continuation there, you know, red. But here we see another play with opposites, green and red, like we saw before with water and fire. Eisenman is a knowledgeable architect. He's a man who articulates well and who is trained, you know, in the intellectual tradition of architecture at a high level. And I think his architecture does show this. I'm not sure about the pieces of furniture here. They don't belong to him, probably. Maybe he would not have used any piece of furniture, certainly not the Kandinsky chair by Marcel Breuer. But, you know, the furniture belongs to the clients. After all, they deserve to have some saying about the house as well, not just the architect. Peter Eisenman also declared, if I'm not mistaken, that apparently the drawing of architecture is more important than the built work. Because it's true, the drawing of architecture, the project is closer to the ideality that animated the mind and the heart of the architect. Maybe he would have mentioned just the mind, not the heart. But I'm not sure I agree with him. You know, maybe the ultimate test of a building is the built work that is confronted with the elements, with the passage of time, with the people using them. But I think we need people like Peter Eisenman to, you know, to stress, to underline the mental, you know, the intellectual substance of architecture. I'm not sure he placed these stones here. If he did, I would salute him gladly, because this would show, you know, an open mind. Although from what I know, he was not fond of Frank Lloyd Wright, nor of his organic architecture. And at the conferences I attended by him, were always interested with Europe, not with the, you know, the architecture of the founders of modernity in North America. Not Wright, not Sullivan, not H.H. Richardson. he was much more interested in Giuseppe Terrani, for example, than in the three geniuses that I just mentioned from his own country. If I remember correctly, from one of his conferences, he mentioned that he had a collection of books and who knows, maybe drawings of Giuseppe Terrani, the rationalist Italian architect. Well, I guess a student created this page that I found on Google Images. And there is some truth here that, yes, at the beginning he was known, in good measure as a theorist and maybe even as a so-called paper architect. We understand now why at 90, today 91, he's so interested in Alberti. Because when I visited one San Lorenzo in Florence, the work of Brunelleschi, and I was exiting and I wanted to find out about a certain building by Alberti. And I asked a young man who was reading a book near the door of San Lorenzo, do you know where this building by Alberti is? And he said, aha, you are interested in the works of the first architect and not the work of the last carpenter. The last carpenter being Brunelleschi and the first architect being Alberti. So I would say that Peter Eisenman is an architect who was building his own biography, professional biography, on the shoulders of Alberti from the very beginning. And he didn't turn his head backwards towards someone like Brunelleschi, or even before Brunelleschi, meaning the Gothic builders. He is a post-Renaissance architect. He always was. Even in its or his deconstructivist mode, which is, is still based on kind of a Renaissance premises, but with a negative sign in front of. I committed an error to mention this because it requires an elaboration and some time, which is not now proper for this. Maybe I will try to explain somehow as we move along about his work. It was my belief from the very beginning that the deconstructivists, they were feeling that architecture after postmodernism was approaching some kind of a dead end, and they were reacting even violently against that, against nostalgia, against many things. The deconstructivists were against what architecture stood for many centuries, if not some thousands of years. But it was this negativity which made me think that they were still on the shoulders of the Renaissance premises, except that they turned against it, but they didn't look backwards to a time prior to the Renaissance. Even now, I'm not sure I explained well what I wanted to say. Let's move forward. The model of Cannaregio project with House 11A at different scales. I like this project from 1978. This is a project for Venice. And you see the same house at various scales. you know, populating this area of Venice. It's an interesting idea to have the same house, the same architectural object, although I think architecture is more than an object. But in his case, perhaps the word or the words architectural object are legitimate. It's because, again, we have a grid here, not clearly represented, but it's based on a grid. You see the squares. No, it's a square. Here is another square. There is a grid. There are, I don't know, 7 squares or 8 or 9, and then in the corners, houses of different scales. I mean, the same house at different scales. And this was supposed to be the house. Of course, most schools of architecture would have condemned this as being no architecture. But with psychoanalysis or not, Peter Eisenman proved those people who were skeptical that he can build wrong, because he started to build. Some people thought that this was a sign of weakness, that he should have remained so-called pure and anchored in his intellectual intensity, instead of compromising with reality and starting to build. I'm not so sure, because again, I think the ultimate test for a building is to be built, if possible. Although these days, maybe we should abstain from building too much if we still care about this world. Here we see plans, this is what he always did at the beginning. Start with a grid or start with a square, and then problematize them through slight deviations, through deformations, an attempt to bite his own tail, kind of like the mythological snake. From formalist to weak form. In the early 90s, he was very preoccupied with weak form or architecture and weakness, which is a little paradoxical, considering that his name in translation would be, like in German, the Iron Man, Eisenman. So the Iron Man would be interested in weak architecture or architecture and weakness. Choral Works, that's the book that I mentioned that he produced together with Jacques Derrida. Let's see, Jacques Derrida and Peter Eisenman. And what you see here, there are actually penetrations within the book. So these are holes that pierce the book through all its pages, from the front cover to the back cover. The Wexner Center for the Arts, Columbus, Ohio. At one time, this building made me very nervous, and I wrote against it. Someone said, by the way of this building, or by the way of some other buildings by Peter Eisenman, that Eisenman's architecture is a decaf architecture. It smells like it tastes like it, but it isn't it. So, decaf architecture. Infuriating for someone with different likings in architecture. I mean, you look at these towers, which are mimicking, in a way, they are frigid, but they are ghostly. They are built, but they are somehow unreal. That's why, this might be indeed a decaf architecture. It smells like it tastes like it, but it isn't it. The lack of historical fidelity in the reconstruction of the armory with the brick walls there, the fragmentation of the form and the insertion of dark glass into the voids left between these fragments seems to speak of the disjointed manner in which we reflect the past, and in turn it serves to remind us of a past we have lost and can never return to. The Wexner Center for the Arts by Peter Eisenman. And yes, we see the grid that he always started from, and then exasperated the grid in an attempt to destroy it. But the grid still remains as a testimony of the beginning of the project, but mainly as a ghost. Finally, a sign of life. I don't know how that man was able to climb there. It's very interesting that the avant-garde of the East Coast didn't build much in New York, where they actually lived, a number of them, but in the Midwest. A curious fact, no? I mean, even Kopp Himmelblau built in Ohio. In Cincinnati, Zaha Hadid built one of her early works, the Museum of Contemporary Art. Here we see in Columbus, Ohio, the Wexner Center for the Arts of Peter Eisenman. Now, the Greater Columbus Convention Center, a massive building that he tried to fragment to escape the deadly monolithical dimensions that would have made this building crashing, and to what extent he succeeded. The attempt was legitimate, to fragment the giant building, and we see here an openness towards ornamentation, because the cubes that animate, the little cubes that animate the larger parts of the building are of ornamental nature. They are not structural in any way. A huge convention center, and we are going, I mean, look, these are not, little houses. They are blocks of flats, but they seem small compared to this giant. And look at the desert, the apocalyptical landscape of highways around it. It's hard to be optimistic when you see something like this. And we are going to see a picture of the interior of the convention center. Look at this. It's deadly. In my opinion, it is deadly. It is frightening. There's large number of identical tables, identical chairs, identical plates, identical everything, maybe even identical people. Very frightening. Look at this. Anxieties plus minus strategies. Yes, I would have been anxious too, trying to respond to such a program as this giant convention center did and does. at least he used some color, even if the color is how to say, is inviting us on a road of illusions, because the colors are so pastel-like and affectionate and kind, but the true realities of the building are very different. No pastels here, in my opinion. The Aronoff Center for Design and Art in Cincinnati. This is the School of Architecture, Cincinnati Architecture School, which needed major interventions, major repair works at the time when I visited it, about 20 years after it was built. So, you know, when a building 20 years after being built needs major renovations, this should make us wonder. He tried to destabilize architecture and education, the education in architecture, through this building, which is, again, if not falling apart, suggesting that that might happen. Not so much at the inside, towards the outside more than inside. And inside, because often inside he rejects even color or uses it much more timidly than outside. It's not really it's not an expressionist architect. He doesn't use violent colors. But inside, even at the City of Culture in Santiago de Compostela, the environment is luminous, almost Apollonian, besides the you know, the deviant gestures of deconstruction. Yeah, we see a little bit of color, but we also see round columns, which normally in deconstruction or deconstructivism should be made illegal or should have been made illegal. And I think the intuitions of Wolf Prix for Kop Himmelblau were correct. I don't think Wolf Prix would have used round columns, but Peter Eisenman did use them, despite the dislocations and disruptions of what we look at here. So this is the School of Architecture in Cincinnati. Cincinnati has a number of signature architectural works by other important architects, Bernard Tschumi, Tom Main, even Michael Graves, in the campus, I mean, the University of Cincinnati. This is, though, the building of Zaha Hadid in Cincinnati, the Museum of Contemporary Art, an early work by Zaha Hadid, the other deconstructivist. Although maybe both Eisenman and Zaha Hadid would have rejected, you know, the label deconstructivist. This is a work that, you know, from above looks maybe more disjuncted than it looks like at the level of the eye. The colors, although they are used, they are rather frigid and with a timid sensuality, which, yes, maybe a psychoanalyst could have interpreted in a certain way. I mean, this, you know, ice cream colors seems to be in contradiction with the very idea of deconstruction, no? Not that I wouldn't like having some ice cream right now. Maybe with the very same colors, you know, vanilla among them. The Biocenter in Frankfurt in Germany, 1987, a project which was not built. He did some interesting works. Koizumi Sangyo building in Tokyo. Tokyo does have earthquakes, but this didn't stop Peter Eisenman from building as he felt like it. and the Japanese built it. He built another one. Built two buildings in Japan, and we are going to see the second one as well. (1987, 1990). This one is the second one, Nunotani office building in Tokyo. Here we see in the plan his preoccupation with Twoness, Twoness, which I thought it was a word invented by him, but I was wrong. There is such a word in English. I checked. Twoness, and there is a Twoness here, and in other words by him, we can talk about Twoness. Yes. As Goethe said in Faust, alas, two souls are dwelling in my heart. Maybe two souls were and are dwelling in Peter Eisenman's heart as well. Maybe one of his souls is fond of the cube, and the other soul is fond of deforming it, torturing it. We are going to see this Twoness also in his project for the Church of the New Millennium, which competition, which was actually won by his cousin, Richard Meyer. We are still in Japan. Now the Checkpoint Charlie project from 1980, not a glorious project by him. The plan for this international building, I don't know, I forgot the exact translation of the three initials. Berlin had three periods during the 20th century when it invited important architects from all over the world to build, housing, houses and blocks of flats in Berlin in the 1930s, in the 1950s, and in the 1980s. And now we are going to see what Peter Eisenman built in Berlin between 1981 and 1985. Is this building, which is the house Checkpoint Charlie, at the intersection where actually Checkpoint Charlie is. Across the Friedrichstrasse, there is a building by diagonally from here by Rem Koolhaas, but this building is rather tamed and not so provocative. Anyway, it was built by Peter Eisenman. Finally, some more powerful color. Now the Peter Eisenman and Max Reinhardt, the Max Reinhardt House in Berlin. This is a building which personally I regret was not built. Although, again, it would have been crashing for the city of Berlin. Here we see the Twoness I mentioned again. We might interpret perhaps that Peter Eisenman had, and maybe still has, some kind of a schismatic mental disposition, that there seems to be a rift we might even call, use a more contemporary language from psychology, some kind of a bipolar disorder, perhaps. But so many of us are not, are not indifferent to what this word bipolar might mean. I mean, maybe the very condition of living in our time implies a certain rift. And the building he imagined for the great director, film and theater director, Max Reinhardt, is a building which would have protested, I would say, against what Berlin was and is. And as such, I think it is a loss that it was not built. This would not have been just another tower. I think intellectually and even artistically, it would have been more engaging, more provocative, and more angst-provoking than some other agitated towers that were built in recent years. The disruptions of the Cartesian system, or the disruptions of the logical system, are obvious, and they make us think of some drawings by Lebbeus-Woods, or even the section through the MIT dormitory by Stephen Hall. It was something in the air, where you disrupt the physiological health of the so-called regular building with excavations that create usually public spaces that are that refuse to conform to the predictability of the rest of the structure. There are rotations also. There are many things happening here. So there is complexity in this building. Now we see a picture of Midsummer's Night's Dream by William Dieter and Max Reinhardt from 1935. And why did I choose to include this picture here? Because we see the beauty and the monster. We see the invitation coming from an undisputable beauty, and then we see the monster, the tamed monster, and there is a complicity between the two. And I think Peter Eisenman understood the relationship, at least to an extent, understood the complicity that exists often between what we call the beauty, or the beautiful, and the ugly. And that's why he wrote an article once about En terror firma, with this title, En terror firma, meaning firmly rooted in terror. And he even talked about grotesques, texts that are grotesque, grotesques. He's very good with language, and he likes to play with words and with language. But in this film by Max Reinhardt, we see this, both tension and affection between the opposites. Now, on the right, the angel. On the left, not the evil, no, but the appearance is certainly not something that we might call beauty or beautiful. And now we look at the drawing by Lebbeus-Woods, where here also we see this duality between a structure that once was, triumphant in its certitude, and then ruined by war or who knows by what. It becomes, an expression of a duality that simultaneously presents to us two opposite sides, just like we see here, in a different way, of course. It's a very nice drawing by this architect who didn't build much, but who drew in very provocative ways. Levius, and he drew brilliantly. And I don't know why I included this picture with a member of the Pink Floyd, Nico che importa del producto finale si te emociona o no. When I made this presentation, I knew, but I guess it's about emotions, no? Emotions which need to be part of the architectural work, and if they are not there, then I think we failed. Another picture from A Midsummer's Night Dream, directed by Max Reinhardt and William Dieterle. You know, once I attended a conference by John Haydock at Cooper Union, and you know, himself a member of the New York Five, and he mentioned the darkness of whiteness, that even whiteness could have dark connotations, and it's true that maybe we can talk like Mark Quigley, and we saw a picture of him, the former dean of Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture and Urban Planning, when Mark Quigley talked about the violence of the domestic, referring to the hut that Martin Heidegger lived in with his wife. And if I contemplate this picture here, I see the angelic Apollonian beauty of these beings dressed in white, but then we see the forest, dark and maybe, you know, even frightening at midnight or sometimes during the late hours of the night. And so there is again this two-ness. On one hand, the aspiration towards light, and on the other hand, the reality, the visceral or otherwise, of something that Apollo would have had nothing to say about or to talk about. Musée du Quai Branly in Paris is a project which he didn't build. Greg Lynn once talked about the worms, W-O-R-M-S, of Peter Eisenman, and here maybe we do see some worms attacking Tour Eiffel, as you can see in the picture on the left. The folded worms of Peter Eisenman. These were the words of Greg Lynn. Bibliothèque de l'IUL, Geneva, Switzerland, another project which was not built, and I actually regret it was not built. It says in progress, but as far as I know, it was not built. Now, the church competition in Rome for the Church of the Millennium, which I said was won by his cousin Richard Meyer. This is the building, and again we see two-ness. We see two sides with a split in between. Of course, the church would not have accepted something like this, but in my opinion, this building would have been truer to a representation of who we are in the 21st century or at the end of the 20th century than the less engaging building by Richard Meyer. In a certain way, this building, if built, would have said, at the most, we can have the desire of faith, but not faith itself. In this sense, this building, if built, would have been truer, I think, than the one built by Richard Meyer. But this would have been a tormented church, a split church. And in the case of Christianity, I think would have been very appropriate now, considering that we have an Eastern and a Western Christianity, often or sometimes at war with each other within the very core of Christianity. But Rome wouldn't have it. And this instead was built by Richard Meyer without anything, controversial about it. Anyway, the Holocaust Memorial, Berlin, a good work by him, and also a good work by Berlin that they offer this large piece of land at the center of Berlin to build this this Holocaust Memorial. The site plan with grid, as I said, he declared that any work should start with a grid. And he started with a grid here too, but then he transformed it into some kind of a Cartesian approximation of a sunflower, if you could imagine something like this. It's a good work, and it's is it dark in its spirit? There is clearly an attempt to I mean, how to situate yourself in terms of optimism vis-a-vis such a grave theme. It's impossible. He had to be assertive in his in the critical dimension of the work, and there is a critical dimension here. Many people died in very tragic circumstances in the Second World War, and unfortunately, it seems we learn nothing. We learn nothing if we contemplate Ukraine. War can make the wheels of the war machine square, but that the architect must make them round. And I would say that in the case of war, the architect should also try to make them square. In other words, the architect should not be accepting the war machine. In this project, Peter Eisenman is meditating on the tragedy of the Holocaust, and I think he does it architecturally in a convincing way. Now, people are not supposed to stand up on or even sit on these, gray reminders of the tombs of the deaths in the Second World War. But life, perhaps, should have the last word in the end. We'll also see people jumping from running on them. And again, life perhaps should be allowed to assert itself. And nature also. Here on the left, we see the building by another North American, that is Frank Gehry, a bank. And this is, of course, by Peter Eisenman, and now trees and vegetation seems to want to fight off the grayness of this Holocaust memorial. And maybe when the dust settles, more green will show up, and thus hopefully more hope. That is, if the war in Ukraine and other wars in this world of ours will stop. Tourists. Andrei Codrescu said that tourists are terrorists with cameras, and terrorists are tourists with guns. An interesting observation. He also made another observation that we replaced the Berlin Wall, since we are now in Berlin, with the Berlin Mall. And in a way, it is true. In what way do we manifest our freedom? By going to the supermarket, to the mall, to shop until we drop? This is why we claimed our freedom, in order to shop and shop and shop. So indeed, maybe we replaced the Berlin Wall with a Berlin Mall. And between wall and mall, just one letter is different. The first one, M or W, and they are in reverse. An M becomes turned upside down, a W, and W becomes an M upside down. Here we see better, the building by Frank Gehry, and this the Holocaust memorial by Peter Eisenman. And there is also an underground part. Now, there is another Holocaust memorial in Budapest, very different, and I thought of showing it with this occasion. Built in 2005, Shoes on the Danube Promenade, an International Holocaust Remembrance Day. So, reminders of the sadness of the Second World War can be done in various ways, not less moving. I wonder what Putin would think if he saw such pictures. He would probably continue his mad war. Will this world ever renounce aggressivity? Budapest. Just shoes at the edge of Danube. And back to Berlin, to a young person jumping from one reminder of death to another reminder of death. But in that jump, there is a yes to life. And here, shoes with a person wearing them, as opposed to the shoes in the previous pictures in Budapest. And the silhouettes of these people that, again, assert life. A bus stop in Aachen, which I think is a good work by Peter Eisenman, is just a bus stop. But who said that just a bus stop cannot be a work of architecture? Of course it can. And this one is. It's not the smallest bus stop in the world, but I think it is skillfully done. So yes, even a bus stop could be architecture. Now, the City of Culture of Galicia in Santiago da Compostela, a vast work where he tried to artificialize landscape to create a building that mimics in a way the landscape, but is architecture, is built by man, not by God or by nature. It was an attempt by Peter Eisenman to bring his architecture, derived as it was at the beginning from the grid, closer to what we call an organic architecture. It's possible there was a lot of pain in this metamorphosis. And insinuations of the old grid are still to be seen on the roofing of the building. So echoes of the grid are still present. Spain, Santiago da Compostela. Of course, we could question a little bit the fact that this stone is actually just a veneer, and that underneath there is steel. And yes, there might be a problem here. You know, it's to an extent it's theater. There is some mimicking taking place here. You know, the architectural hill is actually built of steel, and on top of the steel there are, you know, there is a veneer of stone. On the left here, we see an homage to John Haydock. This was envisioned by John Haydock, the Dean of Cooper Union and member of the New York Five, and perhaps a friend of Peter Eisenman. And this was built after John Haydock died. So it's possible it was an homage from Peter Eisenman to John Haydock. So, like in Berlin, we had Frank Gehry and Peter Eisenman in close proximity. Here we have John Haydock and Peter Eisenman in close proximity in Santiago da Compostela under a dark sky in that picture. So again, here is John Haydock, and here Peter Eisenman, who is 91 years old today, while John Haydock died at 70. The city of culture. What about the culture of the city? Any city. By the way, of any city, he published, in the 90s, a magazine called Any, which we know what the word any means, but also it meant Architecture New York, both Any and Architecture New York. In the dichotomy and the dialectics between nature and culture, if we look here, we see a building which is to an extent approximating the forms of nature, but culture is distinct from nature and sometimes in opposition to nature. But it's very possible that at its best, culture is actually a good relative of nature. Culture inspires itself from nature, but could we say that nature inspires itself from culture? The same relationship exists between art and life. Art is long, life is short. Lady Assouz said the opposite, that life is long and art is short. Art imitates life, but sometimes life imitates art, like in the case of the death of Alexander Pushkin, who died exactly in the same way that his character Onegin died 2 years prior to the death of the poet. How to explain it? Life sometimes copies art. John Haydock and Peter Eisenman. And the drawings. Too much whiteness for my taste. And then the excavations, the erosions within the architectural hill for the spaces that the city of culture required and uses. The interior to me is disappointing. It's rather slick and again, too whitish. You mimic organic forms of a hill in this case, but the colors are certainly not the colors of nature. These are the colors of contemporary or modern frigidity. So was it enough to just employ to an extent organic forms, although he didn't start with organic intuitions, he still started with a grid. But the interior is unconvincing. It's too white and too slick and too frigid, in my opinion. I feel like splashing some cans of gallons of colors in a mad graffiti attempt on the white walls, because they are not alive. To me now, they are exasperating. Outside, they are a little bit better, but not much better. Maybe he couldn't escape the fatality of that decaf architecture that critic mentioned. It smells like it, it tastes like it, but it isn't it. And this is the last image of this presentation with a website that I found, anonymous.com, Peter Eisenman. Let's wish him happy birthday on his 91st birthday. Thank you.